Hi, my name is Jeff. I'm going to be your host for the next hour from outside of Washington, D.C. Wherever you are, welcome to free GMAT Prep Hour, the March 5th, 2019 edition. Ask some questions in chat, getting some, having some decent conversations with some people. A couple people are getting ready to take their official exam in the next month, and we're just kind of chatting some stuff out. I've got a lesson planned for today, but I do think there will be a little bit of time at the end for a variety of questions. So it can be about the lesson today. It can be about the GMAT in general. It could be about other specific topics that you'd like to know about. So hopefully stick around after the lesson and we can kind of talk some things out. Cool. I'll try to be monitoring the chat room. Got a few things happening here, but I do have some breaks, so I'll see if I can check in there and give some responses. Otherwise, I think we might as well just kind of get off and running here. Just want to let you know there are a couple other free resources that Manhattan Prep provides to GMAT studiers. You can always come and then check out a free session 1, the first of our 9-session GMAT course. Anyone's welcome to come to the first session for free, no strings attached. You can do this in person if you live in a city where we have courses that run live. You can also show up to an online class, kind of like this, where an instructor will be talking to you live on camera, and you'll also be on camera, can ask questions, very interactive. It's like an in-person class, but just from the comforts of our own homes. So. Also, you can kind of preview our interactive on-demand course called Interact. All you have to do is follow this link that's on the screen right now, or you can just navigate to our website and find the free resources for the GMAT or the GRE or the LSAT if you're interested in those too. So, cool. All right. So glad that you're here. I'm going to do some learning today, and hopefully everyone can take away some good lessons. Here's kind of the rundown of what we're going to talk about. I thought we'd dive into some critical reasoning. Most of the lessons I've done in the last year maybe have been kind of more quant heavy. So we're going to get into the verbal side of things a little bit. We're going to spend some time breaking down arguments, and really with the goal to look at kind of the logical flaws in critical reasoning arguments, right? Those gaps, those assumptions that the arguer is making. And we're going to kind of leverage that deconstruction and that brainstorming about assumptions to, have a better idea of how to handle a group of different questions. So if you're familiar, if you're not familiar, over here at Manhattan Prep, we recommend a 4-step process for critical reasoning questions. Step 1 is just to figure out what type of question you're dealing with, all right? That can kind of guide the way you want to read down the argument or the paragraph. Step 2, really important, and it's going to be a lot of the focus of today, deconstructing the argument, breaking the argument down into the conclusion, the support for the conclusion, things like that. Step 3, just remind yourself what the goal of this question is. Some of these arguments are confusing, and it's easy to get yourself turned around. So before you go looking at the answer, it's often a great idea just to kind of double check and make sure you know the objective of the question here. And then you want to go in and eliminate the 4 wrong answers, okay? So we're going to kind of walk through that. A big emphasis on step 2, but of course we are also going to finish some of these questions off, work from wrong to right, and settle on some right answers. So thought maybe what we could do now is just kind of practice some basic deconstruction, and then we'll build up to kind of complete questions in a second. Go ahead and take a moment and read this argument down. You may have noticed that there is no question with this argument. That'll come a little bit later, okay? So I just want to read this down and talk to you about maybe some ways that you can deconstruct an argument. Different instructors, different students have different ways to deconstruct arguments. Some write down the role of each sentence or even each phrase or clause in the argument. Some don't write down much at all and do a lot of the deconstruction in their heads. I'll show you what I do, but you'll definitely want to find a method that works for you and that you feel confident with on the test, all right? Don't just kind of do what you heard someone else does, right? Try out a bunch of different methods and figure out what works best for you. So the first thing that I do is I'm going to go hunt down for the conclusion of this argument, okay? Like, what's the single thing the author is trying to tell me? And then I'm going to go ahead and put that on the right side of my space that I'm working. And I do just, do this on the yellow laminated page. I do kind of like to space out my deconstruction notes. Okay, so why don't you take a second and just consider what the conclusion of this argument is. And if you have an idea, go ahead and throw it into the chat box. And once I feel like I know what the conclusion is, I'm going to figure out like why the author believes that conclusion is true. The support that the author uses to kind of, arrive at this conclusion. I put that on the left. All right, and I'm working kind of from left to right. I have the premise or the support that leads to the conclusion. So, hey, I've got some good suggestions in the chat box here. Yeah, watch less TV if you want to avoid depression. I've got another really great suggestion here. Hey, like, it's just everything after the word clearly, kind of using some of these signal words to help kind of guide our analysis here. And yeah, like whoever's arguing this is saying, hey, if you want to avoid depression, just don't watch TV. Okay, hard to do. I do like watching TV. So let's now figure out why the arguer believes that. All right, what is the support that this arguer, whoever he or she is using to arrive at this conclusion? And yeah, it's pretty much the other part of the argument here. Hey, studies have shown that there's some strong correlation between TV time and depression, right? The more TV time, the more likely a person is to be depressed. Okay, so I've got that kind of, laid out left to right here. And you can just double check this, right? Like, why does this person believe the conclusion is true? Why does this person believe that you should watch less TV to avoid depression? Well, because of the information in the premise, because of the strong correlation between TV time and depression. All right, now we've separated kind of these two components out, and you're probably realizing that the logic of this argument just really isn't that airtight. And for the majority of critical reasoning questions, it's this logical looseness, right? This gap that's central to the question. The logical gap is covered by assumptions. All right, so think about what's being assumed in this argument. And sometimes you can best brainstorm assumptions by being skeptical, by being a contrarian, right? Let's kind of question this conclusion, question arriving at this conclusion. I once worked with another instructor, really brilliant guy, Mark Sullivan, and he kind of put it this way. If you ever took a philosophy 101 class, there was probably always this dude in the back who'd always like raise his hand and be like, yeah, but professor, what if this happened? Or, yeah, but have you thought about everything? Like, what if this happens, right? And so, you don't want to be that what if guy, okay? But what if guy, while not a lot of fun to hang out with, probably was pretty good at critical reasoning because he's always questioning the logic of an argument. So I'm getting some good suggestions in the chat room. And some of the people in the chat room, you're welcome to just message me, the panelist. You're also welcome to message the whole group, the panelists and the attendees. I'm getting a lot of both here. All right, so I'm thinking about these assumptions, and one way to kind of brainstorm these is to come up with these what-if questions that a contrarian would pose to this argument. Like, hey, what if there's something else that causes both watching TV more and depression, okay? And the assumption needs to be phrased so that it cleans up that question, right? So an appropriate assumption that answers that question here is something like, oh, well, I'm assuming there isn't a third factor that ends up causing both TV watching and depression. Okay. All right, fine. Well, what if people who are depressed are just kind of naturally drawn to the TV more? Or another way of writing that out is, what if it's not TV that causes depression? What if it's depression that actually drives people to watch the TV more, right? And so another assumption or two assumptions would have to address that. Oh, I'm assuming actually that watching TV causes depression is probably the most succinct way of saying that. Or kind of a subset of that is, hey, depression is not what causes an increase in TV watching. All right, basically getting a lot of these in chat. So the brainstorming is working well here, and maybe this is just like a common enough argument flaw that you are attuned to it, which is great, because we're going to go over some common argument flaws today, and there's only like so many, so it's good to kind of have these on call. Something I just want to make sure here, whether you're a critical reasoning expert or it's kind of your first day in critical reasoning, it's worth repeating. An assumption is something that absolutely has to be true in the arguer's mind in order for the arguer to properly arrive at his or her conclusion, okay? Like the arguer here must believe, you know, that there isn't a third factor that causes both TV watching and depression. Because if you flip that, if you said, oh, there is a third factor that causes both TV watching and depression, then the conclusion is bogus, all right? Take a look at that last grade outline. Depression is not what causes an increase in TV watching. Okay, that has to be true in the arguer's mind. And if an assumption is something that has to be true, if you do the opposite of that assumption, it should actually break down the whole argument. So this is what we call the negation test, and it's a way of kind of checking to see if these assumptions are good ideas, all right? So what I can do is I can say, hey, depression is actually, if I cross out not here, depression is what causes an increase in TV watching. Well, that destroys the whole argument that you should watch less TV to avoid depression. And because we've negated this assumption we had come up with, it destroys my argument, which means the original assumption that was there was actually a good one. Okay, cool. All right, so we're going to come back to this question in a moment. But what I want to do now is talk about kind of some general question types that you'll see on the GMAT. And the reason we place kind of such value in this assumption brainstorming is because there are really kind of like a handful of question types that make up the majority of your critical reasoning questions, and they're all related to these assumptions. Or we call them the assumption family. In fact, I did a count from the official guide earlier, and over 70% of the critical reasoning questions are related to assumptions, and we group them in the assumption family. And here are the four most common types of questions. One is just find the assumption. Sometimes the question will be like, hey, which of the following is an assumption that the argument depends upon? But if it doesn't say the word assumption, it looks something like this. Hey, the argument above depends on which of the following, and we know that arguments depend on these assumptions. They have to be true in the arguer's mind. Which of the following is required? Same thing. All right, strengthen the argument. All right, another big assumption family question. And if it doesn't just say like which of the following strengthens the argument, it's going to have language that's pretty similar to it, right? Which of the following, if true, most supports the argument? That's the same as strengthens. Which of the following, if true, does most to justify the recommendation or the analyst's expectations or the idea that the plan will work or something like that? All right, on the flip side of strengthen, we've got weaken. It might just come out and say, hey, which of the following, if true, weakens the argument? But you could also see some synonymous language like this. And then evaluating the argument, hey, which of the following considerations would be most important to determine in order to properly evaluate this argument or to assess this? What's going to be the most useful to find out? Something like that. And that's pretty much it. Like the majority of your questions on the actual GMAT are going to come from these 4 question types, which is why it's so critical that we spend time considering the gaps in the argument and the assumptions that kind of close those gaps. All right. So let's see how these 4 question types might be applied to that, TV depression argument. So here's kind of the work we just did. If you got one of these questions, hey, the argument above depends on which of the following, that's the language for find the assumption. And we've already found some really good assumptions, all right? We might not have found all of them, and you can't be expected to, brainstorm absolutely every single assumption of every single argument, but spending some time brainstorming does pay dividends. And so an answer that might fit this question would be, hey, depression is not what causes an increase in TV watching. One of the things we came up with. Yeah, I had just a quick comment here. I said the majority of your questions will be from the assumption family. Hey, the rest will be, explain a discrepancy. That's another one. Not nearly as common as some of these other ones, but explain a discrepancy. Describe the role, or describe how these the lines in bold function in the argument. Another suggestion was a fill in the blank, and I will say most fill in the blanks are actually strengthened questions. Yeah, fill in the blanks are a little strange. They're actually the only critical reasoning question that has the question above the argument. And it's usually like, hey, which of the following answers best completes the argument? And usually what happens at the end of that argument is you get a, blah, 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 since blank. And the word since usually signifies you're going to, give some support, right? The word since, because is used for justification. And that kind of informs you you're most likely going to be dealing with one of these strengthened questions. Some other types of kind of the, the non-assumption family questions would be an inference or draw a conclusion. That one's a good question type, not an assumption family question. In fact, it's like completely devoid of assumptions. When you're drawing an inference, you can't assume anything on the GMAT. It has to be, airtight. What must be true based on the following information. And yeah, there's some rarer types like, which of the following mimics the argument or something like that. But again, those are kind of fringe categories. All right, good comment though, thanks. Yeah, I don't mind going on little tangents here. This is all good. Just no questions right now about like 2 trains that are moving in opposite directions or something. That's a little too tangential here. All right, so here's another one. Hey, which of the following, if true, most supports the recommendation? Oh, this is one of these strengthener type questions. That's the language most supports. And so maybe we just need something that kind of bolsters one of these assumptions, right? It doesn't have to be specifically the assumption, but it might be something that makes us kind of think, hey, one of those assumptions I came up with is like more likely true now. So something like this. Hey, studies have determined that bad weather is not what causes both depression and increased TV viewing. And that kind of hits at this kind of this top assumption I have, right? There isn't a third factor. Well, I haven't ruled out like all the potential third factors, but I've definitely ruled out weather as the cause of both these things. And so, yeah, that kind of strengthens this idea that there might not be a third factor, though it doesn't guarantee it, right? Okay. Which of the following would most weaken the likelihood that the recommendation would work? Another study. A recent study has shown that when a person suffers from depression, that person's more likely to watch TV than participate in any other activity. That kind of shows that maybe the causality arrow goes in the other direction, though it doesn't have to be that case, right? But it does kind of cast some doubts that watching TV is actually what causes depression. And then finally, hey, which of the following would be most important to determine in order to evaluate the argument? Well, let's think about whether depression, in fact, drives people to watch more TV, right? If depression does indeed drive people to watch more TV, then that really like weakens this argument, right? But if I find out that depression does not drive people to watch more TV, well, then it actually strengthens the argument a little bit, because now I know the causality arrow doesn't go the opposite way. Okay, and that's the key to these evaluate questions, right? You want to be able to answer this hypothetical in a couple different ways, right? The two opposite ways, like yes, depression does drive people to watch more TV, or no, it doesn't. And one of those should weaken the argument, and the other one should strengthen the argument, and that's it. Yeah, that can take a lot of time. It's this kind of branching out two different ways. And so, you know, there are ways to kind of prevent having to do that for all 5 answer choices. And we'll talk about kind of how you can cleanly and, you know, relatively easily eliminate wrong answers. So you don't have to be, you know, super, you know, rigorous in checking them all with this, well, if I answer it 2 different ways, is it strengthened, does it weaken? Yeah. So yeah, you want to have good kind of techniques to rely on when it gets to crunch time, but I think you'll find that the more brainstorming you do and the more kind of understanding and of the deconstruction of an argument you feel comfortable with, some answer choices will just kind of immediately pop out as being pretty clearly wrong. And so there might only be 2 that you're kind of stuck between, and then you can try you know, the negation technique for one of those assumption questions, or you can try kind of answering an answer choice 2 different ways like this and see, hey, you know, if depression does drive people to watch more TV, that would weaken the argument. If it doesn't drive people to watch more TV, that would actually strengthen the argument. And yeah, that's going to be time consuming to do for all 5, but you'll be able to eliminate a few relatively easily. Cool. All right. Good stuff. So, like, as you can see, like, all of those question types really demand us to consider that gap between the support or the premise and the author's conclusion. And then this is why I recommend spending some good focused time deconstructing the argument into conclusion and premise. And then after you've done that, like, brainstorm the gap. Like, what's different on the left side, like the way I do it? Like, what's different on the left side and the right side? What shifts? What I would recommend is spending some good time doing that before you look at the 5 answers. And the reason is, if you don't have a good understanding of kind of the specifics of an argument, the answer choices, which are all like, they're all related to the words in the argument in some sense. If you don't have a good understanding of what the true argument is and the scale and the scope of it, the answer choices can get really confusing. Like, a lot of them are tempting, but they're tempting for the wrong reasons, right? You kind of see that they relate to the argument, but they actually don't relate in the correct manner. And so spending some good time deconstructing and brainstorming assumptions before looking at the answer choices is my recommendation. And I was talking with another instructor about this, Reed Arnold, and he does some of these free prep hours as well. And he had this really cool observation. He's like, yeah, I think in critical reasoning and reading comp, students look at the answer choices too early and get a little confused by them and get kind of, you know, I don't know, distracted by the details in the answer choices. But what's funny is, a lot of times in quant, like in problem solving, students look at the answer choices too late, like too late in the problem, when you should be looking at the answer choices kind of at the beginning to give you hints as to, you know, how might you solve this question? Can you pick numbers if there are variables anywhere? Like, are the answers really spread apart? Can you estimate here? Could you kind of plug them in and work backwards if that's an option? And a lot of times in quant, we see that too late. So, you know, in problem solving, get in the habit of looking at the answer choices early. And then in reading comp and critical reasoning, get in the habit of kind of delaying looking at the answer choices, or you will be tempted into picking things that aren't really relevant to the argument or to the passage. Cool. All right, so we're going to come up with a little bit of a list here of some common logical flaws and you know, I saw some really good ideas for this one. Hey, the logical flaw here is that just because you've got two things happening at once doesn't mean one causes the other. And this is just kind of like embarrassingly easy, right? How many times have you heard that like correlation does not imply causation? Too much, but it's a relatively common argument flaw on the GMAT. So we're going to come up with a few more of these as we go. So let's spend some time working on another argument here. All right, take a moment and try to deconstruct this thing into premise, conclusion, and maybe start brainstorming some of the gaps. All right, that's been a minute. I think a minute's a good kind of time to check in. You know, a minute through a critical reasoning question, I'd say you want to have this thing, you know, read down. You're having good work done on the deconstruction. You know, you've already thought about some of the gaps because you want to leave some time to take a look at the answer choices, of course. Average about 2 minutes per critical reasoning question is a good pace. So halfway through, you know, have most of the deconstruction done and considering some of the gaps here. So let's deconstruct it. Let's get me back to PowerPoint here and deconstruct this thing. Conclusion, what's the conclusion of this argument? Go ahead and let me know in the chat room. Yeah, someone actually commented that for this process, like just practicing a lot will make you feel better. Yeah, I think that's the same for a lot of this kind of process stuff on the GMAT that aren't things you've done every day. This deconstructing, brainstorming might take a little while at first, but kind of the more proficient you become, the easier this gets. You'll start being able to kind of see gaps in arguments, almost without like having to do too much hard thought, just because you've recognized those gaps in other forms before. So really good point there. Cool. Hey, here's the conclusion. I'm getting the answer in chat. This is awesome. Hey, that new cigarette tax, that's not going to limit the use of tobacco products as much as these people are hoping. Yeah, it's just not going to work. Oh, okay. Well, why not? It's got to be the other sentence, right? Oh, it's not going to work because cigarette smokers, they're just going to switch. They're just going to switch to buying cigars and chewing tobacco to avoid that tax. Oh, okay. Well, I don't know if I think that's airtight, right? Let's think about some of the gaps there. Can anyone suggest some flaws in this logic? Kind of, what are we assuming here? I think we're kind of assuming a couple things. Yeah, I mean, I like that. These are good ideas. I got one that says, hey, assuming everyone's just going to switch, as if that's no big deal. You're assuming that cigars and chewing tobacco are also not going to get taxed. Yeah, I think this is good. I like that the way this one's put. Cigars and chewing tobacco are good substitutes for cigarettes. Yeah, really kind of good things here. You're predicting a couple things. Like you're kind of predicting that in some way, cigarettes are exactly the same as cigars and tobacco, right? Yeah, here it is. Smoking cigars is the same, or cigarettes is the same as smoking cigars. Yeah, like you're kind of assuming that in the smokers' minds, like they see cigarettes and cigars and tobacco as like interchangeable. It's like, I don't think you can do that, right? I'm sure there are some similarities. There's tobacco products, they have nicotine, things like that. But just because they have some similarities doesn't mean they're exactly the same, right? And so, you know, you could ask this, like, what if cigarette smokers just like hate cigars and chewing tobacco? I have to assume, in order for this argument to hold up, that cigarette smokers aren't bothered by the differences, really, right? They can just switch without it being that big a deal. Yeah. And other people were kind of talking about the cost here. You guys are like playing right into my PowerPoint presentation. This is awesome. Hey, what if cigars and chewing tobacco are, you know, tend to be more expensive than cigarettes, and they still will be after the new tax goes into effect? Well, in order to have this argument hold up, you need to say that cigarette smokers wouldn't find the cost of cigars and other tobacco products to be a deterrent. Yeah, really, really good here. Okay, I think we've done some good work here. Let's kind of move what we've come up with down, and now I'm going to show you a weaken the argument. So I need to kind of poke a hole in one of these assumptions, or at least attack it a little bit. And so why don't we take a moment and look at these answer choices here. I'll give you some time. Don't tell me in the chat room. I'll put up a poll in a second, and you can poll in. All right, so there's the poll. Should be able to poll in if you feel like you're ready. Give you another 30 seconds or so. Cool. All right, that's a good place to stop it there. Yeah, I'm seeing kind of more votes coming in. Thank you for that. Yeah, seeing a variety of answers here, but we're kind of clustered around one. We'll reveal which one in a little bit. Actually, I'll just show you right now. Here are the results of the poll. You see, no one likes answer C, and for good reason. Answer C is totally out of bounds here. Like, you know, even if health advocates did use tobacco products, like, you know, imagine like I'm a health advocate and I'm a smoker, and I hear that like there's going to be a new tax on cigarettes. I could be like, well, it's not going to stop me. Like, I'm just going to keep smoking my cigarettes, right? So that doesn't really weaken the argument. In fact, it's just kind of what we would say out of bounds. I don't need to know about the habits of the health advocates to be able to answer this question. And you'll see they didn't come up in our assumptions anywhere either, right? So that's kind of another red flag. So we should be able to mark off answer C, just like many of you did as well. Cool. All right, let's go just kind of down the list here. Let's look at A. Cigars and chewing tobacco can satisfy the nicotine cravings of most cigarette smokers. If you thought answer A was wrong, tell me why. Yeah, this is support, I think, right? In a sense, if you're saying that cigars and chewing tobacco can fulfill the role of cigarettes, you are kind of saying that they're mostly interchangeable. Which goes to the point that the cigarette smokers will shift to cigars and chewing tobacco. So this is kind of why we want to make sure that we double check what type of question it is. I need to weaken this argument. I need to make sure that, you know, I need to make sure that like we're not going to shift to cigars and tobacco, right? And since A says they are going to shift to cigars and tobacco, that's the opposite of what we want. So that's kind of one of those, it's the right answer to the wrong question, right? If this were a strengthened question, that would look pretty good. Cool. All right. Good stuff. Oh, I've got some stuff coming in here. I think D is about another different tax, which isn't relevant to the question about the tax on cigarettes for the next month. Yeah, and I really like how Mia said the next month, because D is talking about a different time frame. Like maybe the government will raise prices on cigars and chewing tobacco through these taxes over the next few years, but I'm concerned with the next month, right? And when the law takes effect. And so that's kind of a little outside the time boundaries of my argument here. Yeah. Yeah, you're right. D does say might as well, which kind of is like, maybe the government will, maybe it won't. I think that's okay. You can have kind of degrees of certainness with strengthen and weaken questions, not assumption questions. Assumptions are more absolute, but might, I think, is like a little bit of a gray area here. And maybe, you know, it wouldn't strongly weaken if D were an appropriate answer. It would just like kind of weaken. But now you'd have to compare the weakenings of all the answer choices to see if it's ironically a strong enough weaken. But I think the word might, you know, isn't necessarily a huge red flag there. I'm more concerned with the next month and the course of the 2 years. Cool. All right. Okay, so B versus E. Ooh, this one's a little tricky because this one's about the difference between cigars and chewing tobacco and cigarettes, right? They're sufficiently different. They're different enough to not just be able to substitute. But this is also about the cost, which seemed important as well. So how do we feel about this? I think these are kind of the two answers that, you know, are the last two standing, like the final face-off. Well, I think, again, we can look at kind of the detail in E. They are currently, right? Not chewing cigars and chewing tobacco will still be more expensive than cigarettes. It's that they are right now. And, you know, there's going to be a tax coming up in the near future. And so just because they're more expensive than cigarettes right now doesn't necessarily mean that they're going to be in the future. I need more information. I need to know kind of like how much more expensive they are now, or how much the new tax is going to be, and is that going to be enough to take cigars over the or cigarettes over the cigar and tobacco price? Yeah, or are they just going to kind of be the same price, and then people would still end up smoking the cigarettes because they're comfortable with that? Yeah, so I think E is close, but the R currently, as opposed to the next month, is kind of a tricky little detail here. And so here's B, and B was the one we were kind of clustered around, and it kind of is getting at, it's attacking this idea that cigarette smokers aren't bothered by switching to other types of tobacco products. Like if the taste and the smell and the texture of these things are so different that cigarette smokers don't want to use them, that flies in the face of this assumption. It actually says now that cigarette smokers are bothered by switching to other types of tobacco products. And what we've just done there is we've negated this assumption, and we talked about earlier, when you negate an assumption, if that assumption was legit to begin with, now that it's flipped to the opposite, the whole argument crumbles, which is the goal of weakening the argument. So yeah, so you know, if you picked A, you know, make sure you're double checking what you're supposed to do. I know it says strongly in here, so you might see that, oh, I'm supposed to strengthen this thing. Read carefully. Every word matters in critical reasoning. You know, every word matters in critical reasoning and sentence correction and quant problems. Somewhat ironically, like you can get away with not reading every word really carefully and reading comp, but that's another story. Yeah, so if you picked A, just make sure that you are really reading those questions carefully. C, good job, no one picked that one. D and E, time frame details, kind of important there. Cool. All right, so let's update some of these logical flaws. I've got a couple more to add here. What were some of the logical flaws in that argument? Well, I saw some good ideas. One is, yeah, the time frame thing, I like that. But one is, hey, just because there's some similarity, like, doesn't mean that they're exactly the same. Hey, all tobacco products, people who use them will just use any other one. Like that doesn't fly, right? So watch out kind of for that logic. Another thing is this idea, and these are so simple once you see them on the screen, right? But like, oh, I'm expecting people to do something. Like, are they actually going to do it, right? Like, I'm expecting people to just switch from cigarettes to cigars. Like, are they really going to do that? Oh, another one just came in, but I don't want to spoil it because it's coming up a little bit later. But I can already tell you guys are thinking of some good logical flaws. Another one that you can kind of think about this, and it relates to this idea of expectation versus reality, is has to do with like trying to predict the behavior of people, right? And you know, people are pretty fickle. That's so predicting behavior of a population is pretty tough, and you want to think like, hey, is that prediction, like, can I attack that at all? Okay, good stuff. All right, you guys are on fire here. All right, we're gonna go through a few more. We'll pick up this pace a little bit. So here's the next one. Go ahead and take another minute and try to break this thing into premise and conclusion and do some brainstorming work. Oh boy, all right, here we go. Another study. Yeah, studies are often used as premises and supports, but we'll find that like you can't always draw too many conclusions from these studies, or a lot of times improper conclusions are drawn from studies. So here's kind of what we've got for the conclusion. Sorry, here we go. Switching between PowerPoint and other programs. Hey, colleges in Tycho City haven't prepped students for the business world. Shame on them. All right, why is that? Well, it's because college grads in Tycho City they don't know how to write a business letter. And therefore, it means the colleges in Tycho City just haven't prepped students for the business world. All right, one thing to look at when you're brainstorming your assumptions, what's shifting, even in the details, from the premise to the conclusion, right? Look at those details. Someone tell me something that's shifting. Okay, I've got a couple good suggestions here. Yeah. Notice that the premise talks about business letters, and the conclusion is about the business world. That's a shift, right? So one thing that's being assumed there is, hey, to be prepped for the business world, you got to know how to write a business letter. Like, is that critical to be ready for the business world? What if you can do everything else related to the business world, but you just don't know how to write a business letter? I mean, maybe at that point you're still ready. It's like one little hole in your resume, okay? But this argument is saying, nope, got to be able to write a business letter to be considered prepared. Good. Another thing that's happening from premise to conclusion. The premise is about the college graduates in this city, and the conclusion is about the colleges in this city. And that is subtle, but it's relatively common. So what needs to be assumed here is that those are somehow like really, really tightly related, right? The college grads in Tycho City went to school at the Tycho City colleges. Yeah, and so kind of spotting the little differences from premise to conclusion, it's in the details, is oftentimes like where these harder questions will get you. Okay, so let's take a look. Which of the following would provide additional evidence in support of the claim above? Okay, so that has all the language of a strengthen. So which of these strengthens the argument? Give you a little more time here and then we'll poll in. All right, the poll is up. Another 10 or 15 seconds on this poll. All right. Go ahead and end it here. Here are the results. All right, so here's what I'm saying. Like a lot of times you will pretty clearly know that some of these answers just can't be right, right? So you don't have to be super rigorous about like getting into each of them, especially after you've done some practice here and you've learned to kind of trust your intuition on these things. You'll see that like B, C, and D are unrelated really to the specifics of the argument here. All right, so let's take a look at these. Like B, for example, like we know B's out because we're talking about some other college in some other city. Like, hey, this is only about Tycho City. Like, get out of here, Twyla. Like, mind your own business. Pun intended. Get out of here. We don't care about you. We don't care about other cities in this argument. It's only Tycho City, so B's out. Hey, most Tycho City college graduates move outside the Tycho City area after they graduate. That's the opposite of what we want, right? That kind of goes against what we're trying to say, and we can kind of see how that works with our second assumption here. That's the opposite of that second assumption, right? So we got to get rid of that. Most Tycho City college students live in on-campus dormitories. Yeah. That's completely unrelated. But one other subtle thing about D that can give you a hint as to why the fourth wrong answer is wrong is that this is about college students maybe in the present, and I want to be talking about college graduates. And so if you can spot maybe that issue in D, A is also going to be wrong because it's about current students attending colleges in Tycho City. And I don't care about the current students. I care about the college graduates. So if you picked answer A, it's probably for one of two reasons. One, you missed that the premise is about the grads and not the current students. Or potentially you thought like that business letters and readiness for the business world only matter to business majors or something like that. And I think if you find yourself making and not just identifying an assumption, but if you are assuming that like, oh, you know, business letters are really just really important for business majors and not anyone else, you want to kind of pump the brakes, right? We want to be diagnosing assumptions or like identifying them and not making our own ones. Like I can confidently say that my elementary school failed to prepare me for the fashion world and the culinary world. were those things important in elementary school? Not for my elementary school, but like the claim is still leveled. They failed to prepare me. Doesn't seem really relevant to the real world, but it's still actually a fair argument on my part, a fair assertion. So I don't know, you want to be sure like you're not kind of confusing real world relevance with relevance in these GMAT arguments. And so answer E is correct, and it pretty much gets at this idea that, hey, these college graduates in Tycho City are really like from the colleges in Tycho City. Yeah, so great job on that one. All right, I've got one more, but before we get to it, we got to update the list. Update the list. So what are some of what was like the flaw here? I would say issues of representativeness, and this is one of these things that goes with studies, right? We had this study, and it says that college grads in the Tycho City area are bad at something. And so from that study, I'm going to make this giant claim that's about potentially a different population, right? Like another thing, like, oh, I noticed that the Starbucks down the the block away from me is going out of business. Like, clearly that means Starbucks as a company is like its best days are in the past. Like, I don't know, like it might just be one thing. It might have just had a really bad manager or something like that. So you can't take kind of a small data set and blow it up on a big one. And you also can't take one data set and map it onto a different one. Right? So issues of representativeness happen quite a bit too. Yeah, I like that, part to whole. Good. That's kind of like our some similarity versus complete similarity, right? Part to whole a little bit there. I like the way you put that. All right, I got one more here. And I think I'm just going to go ahead and show you the whole thing, right? I think we've worked up to this. Let's do the whole thing here. I would prefer, I'm going to recommend that you spend the first bit of your 2 minutes deconstructing and brainstorming, and then look at the answer choice a little bit later. I will let you know when we are halfway through time here. Here we go. All right, that's been 1 minute. I will put the poll up in a little bit. All right, here's the poll. All right, that's 2 minutes. You can take a little bit more time if you need it. I'll let the timer keep going a little bit. Interesting results. All right, I think we'll stop it there about 2:15. All right, pretty one-sided here. There are the results. Yeah, good stuff here. I'll just go ahead and I don't want to leave you on the edge of your seats, but the majority has it. The answer is indeed D here. So 93% success rate. It's really good. Hey, you know, this is from the official practice starter kit. This is labeled as a hard question. You know, they have easy, medium, and hard. This one's from the hard batch. So you guys should feel good about yourself. Let's go ahead and break this thing down. You guys should be feeling good about yourself anyway, but you know, further support here. Let's take a look at what's happening here. Anyone want to go out on a limb and tell me what the conclusion of the argument is here? I mean, why would he be asking it with a smile on his face? What's the conclusion of this thing? Yeah, last sentence. Yeah, close. Okay, I was we'll talk about it a little bit. What is it? Game of Thrones starts April 14th? What is it? Oh, wrong chat box. I was like, am I taking too long? Like, you got stuff to do? It's like only 40 days away. Got it. All right. All right. Premise and conclusion. Yeah. Oh, someone nailed it. It is tricky. There's a couple of yeah. So here's what this, you know, official is saying. Like, well, if you won't let us be lobbyists, then we can't earn a living. And that's not good. Like, really, like, to be pedantic here, the conclusion is that this is unfortunate. And you kind of know that because, like, everything after it has this because, which means that's support, right? So it's really kind of the unfortunateness that's the conclusion. But all we're going to do here is we're going to hack away like any of the logical gaps here. So I would say like one assumption is that, okay, I guess the ability to earn a living is necessary to be considered fortunate. Like if you really wanted to be strict, that is an assumption that's being made here. But we probably want to focus our time on the first arrow and the gap that it covers. And I see some good suggestions here. It's assuming that, you know, a lobbyist is the only job through which these officials can earn a living. And so, because if like the lobbyist was one of 1,000, you know, well-paying jobs or high-paying jobs that these people could get, then this argument falls apart, right? Like, oh, I can't be a lobbyist. Whatever will I do? Not the case here. And so we're going to hunt down the answer, and there it is. Indeed, pretty much exactly what a handful of you had brainstormed. Because like if they can get other jobs, then that's going to ruin the argument. So actually, before we kind of wrap up in a little bit and kind of list some more things on the logical flaw sheet, I actually want to talk a little bit about this idea of otherness and answer choices. And a lot of people want to see, like, whenever there's the evoking of some other stuff in an argument, they want to get rid of it. But if I changed this, let me just say, like, if I changed this argument around a little bit, like, and I asked, like, hey, which of the following would weaken? Like, what would weaken the argument? And there were an answer like, I'll type it at the bottom here. There are lots of other high-paying jobs for these people to get. That would be a good answer choice. And what's happening here is like, a lot of people would see this answer and be like, oh, other high-paying jobs. I don't care about other high-paying jobs. Like, that one's got to go. And we actually did that on the previous question, if you remember, right? I said, like, I don't care about that city, Twyla. I don't care about other cities. I only care about Tycho City. But, like, Jeff, now you're saying, like, you do care about other high-paying jobs here? So, like, what's the rub? Like, when do I care about other things? When do I not care about other things? Can anyone articulate that? there are some, you know, official guide questions where like the word other isn't the right answer. You know? Well, that's the key. Like, when is it relevant to the argument, right? Like, how do you know? Because sometimes other stuff, like these other cities in that Tycho City business readiness question, like other cities didn't matter. But here, like the other jobs besides lobbyists do matter. Yeah, so I would say it's kind of like in the previous argument, let me see, which slide was that? In the previous argument, we were only talking about Tycho City in both the premise and the conclusion, right? And so because of that, we're like pretty narrowly defining the whole scope of the entire argument around Tycho City. And there's got boundaries there. Like, now I don't care about things outside of Tycho City. But in this one, sorry, switching things. In this one, there's a shift in scope from the premise to the conclusion, right? It's not all about lobbyists and lobbyists. The premise is about lobbyists, and later on, the argument is about all ways to earn a living. And when you see that like super specific to super general, then it might be worth thinking about other things. Like, oh yeah, that Starbucks down the street just closed. Clearly, like, Starbucks as a company is folding. Like, nah, there's like 4,000 other Starbucks that had record revenues last month, right? So, you know, there I do care about other things because I'm changing from really specific to really general. And when you do that, there are often other things you need to consider. Cool. All right, so let's kind of keep going here with these logical flaws, specific to general. All right, it's also kind of an issue of representativeness a bit. So kind of following there, and here lobbyist is super specific, general ways to earn a living. Watch out for those kind of shifts in scope within an argument. Following up on that a little bit, if a premise is about specific numbers and the conclusion is about like a percentage, that's also a little shady, or vice versa, right? If the premise is about a percentage and then you're trying to derive something about like the specific numbers related there, that can be a clear flaw. I have a couple other ones. Really common one you see sometimes, just because you know about revenue doesn't mean you know everything about profit, right? You've got to consider all three components of that equation. What about the cost? What about the cost? And then one more I've got here, and someone even brought it up, and maybe you see this like whenever you do some investment, right? Like, past performance is not indicative of future success, right? Just because of what happened in the past, that doesn't necessarily mean it's going to continue in the future or even in the present. So these kind of time frames. And from that matter, like the near future doesn't really kind of portend anything significant about the long-term future too. So time frame flaws too.